Uduasha city, where the sun is a mirror and the moon a shadow. 800 years ago, the gates of death were broken by the Emperor Immortal. The five key bearers, however, had already unlocked them and walked right through. It is in Uduasha city they dwell. Now, the ghost field breathes next to our reality, lit by the eternal flame of the well of Udu. It is a second skin, a place where thought and will struggle against gravity and light. In other places, the dead congregate in the ghost field, but in Uduasha, the well city, the hell city, they fall straight into the flames. See its glittering districts: Kshitijpur, where the rich plot to buy the horizon; Bunda West, where the refugees of two different nations flock; and Pasarhandu, the vertical maze of market and murder. And here is Udepat, where the ceaseless temple resides. Its inhabitants, a family, a snake, and a god. The temple has stood since before the gods of this world were forgotten. Watch as it turns the wheels of revolution. Welcome to Desperate Attune, an actual play podcast about people who take risks so they can survive against the odds.
Hi, this is Soumithri or Tree, and welcome to our world building episode of A Candle Ablaze, our Blades in the Dark campaign set in Uduasha, the capital city of Iruvia. In this episode, we mostly talk about the ways that we came up with the world of Uduasha that you see in our show, which both builds on but also deviates from the canon Uduasha that exists in the special edition of Blades in the Dark. We talk about the inspirations that we've taken from our own lives and the fiction and themes that we're interested in. And we also talk about some of the things that we're interested in exploring during the show. This episode is a bit longer than our shows normally are, and we meander more than we normally do, but we feel that this gives you a more interesting and a broad view of the way that we went about thinking about the show. So I hope you enjoy.
What is Uduasha and what is Blades in the Dark? So our first campaign, A Candle Ablaze, is set in the world of the Shattered Isles, which is the default setting of the game we're playing, the Blades in the Dark. And Blades in the Dark is set in a city called Duskwall, which is kind of a Victorian London crossed with Venice, with several fantastical elements on top of them, including the fact that the sun is broken and the world is plunged into eternal night. The Shattered Isles are ruled by an immortal emperor who apparently has broken the gates of death. Because the gates of death have been broken, there is now something called the ghost field, and generally when people die, their ghosts emerge in the ghost field. And in Duskwall, there's a very specific procedure of boiling people in Leviathan blood, refined Leviathan blood, to make sure that those ghosts don't haunt the city. And there is a general theme of a kind of industrialized mad science versus an occult, ghost and demon-laden world. So that is kind of the broad setting. The best question to get us rolling, which is, why did we pick Uduasha, which is a different city in the same setting, compared to the base setting, which is Duskwall, which is something that everyone in this game is very familiar with, and I think we've played in it a lot. We know it really well, but we decided we wanted to do something different. So why did we feel like Uduasha was where we wanted to be for this campaign? Cloud, do you want to take this first?
Yeah. Well, you and I have spoken about Uduasha a fair few times in the past, ever since we met and started playing Blades together. Largely because, so Uduasha is interesting because, aside from Duskwall, it is the only other city in the Shattered Isles setting. It has like an official supplement of sorts. Not a full supplement, it's just got a small section at the end of the Blade Special Edition, which a lot of people have since had their hands on and looked through. Yeah, so this makes it like interesting because it's the other setting that has material on it, right? But you and I think like a lot of people, like it's not just something that you and I just exclusively have a problem with, because it's quite problematic in certain respects, really Orientalist, and aside from just being fairly Orientalist and a bit like lacking, I think, in imagination, and also it's very, very short. So it's quite frustrating in many respects. Like if you were to actually want to play a campaign in Uduasha, there's not that much material. The city itself feels fairly underbaked, especially if you're from South Asia, which is so Uduasha is of course a city in the land of Iruvia, which is sort of based on this Orientalist milieu, right? India, Persia, Egypt. It says as though those countries and lands are similar at all. Like if you're from any of these places in the real world, you know what like India is like. I'm from Bangladesh. You're from India, so we know what South Asia is like, and it can feel like very frustratingly cardboard cutout version of it. In a certain respect, I suppose Dustwall is a bit like that as well. Like it's a pastiche of Europe with like European Victorian sensibilities. Still, I think like people bring a lot more to that setting. And I suppose what we wanted to do is to kind of like bring our vision of Uduasha, kind of like reinvent it, kind of like taking the base elements that are still in the manual. So it's not like a radical reinvention of the city where like nothing's the same. Still take most of the core elements and then kind of like, what would we write for this city? What would we make it like? I think is the answer.
Yeah. And I think a lot of the kinds of things that we enjoyed doing for world building for this campaign did end up being about, what do we enjoy making this kind of like specific, right? Soap, I think, as the third resident South Asian in our game, I wanted to ask you, what do you think Uduasha seems like to you? Like, what is the appeal of Uduasha and playing in it to you?
I feel like with the Uduasha that we've created, there is while the Uduasha that we created, like I'll just add on to what Klow was saying, is that while Dustfall in the original Blades is also a pastiche of Europe, it feels like a pastiche that was created with an informed approach, where the Uduasha that I saw in the supplement sort of just felt like the kind of vaguely Middle Eastern place you might find in any number of Hollywood films, right? And I think that the Uduasha that we've created is still a bit of a pastiche of different places. I think it's got bits of like India has got bits of maybe like Pakistan, Afghanistan, that kind of thing, but it's an informed place. Like I mean, I'd be biased because I had a hand in creating it, but it feels like so far playing this game, it feels like a real place with fantastic elements, of course, but it feels like a lived-in place, a place it could grow organically once you accept the premise that it's in this magical fiery pit.
Yeah, fair. And I think that like there is something about the pastiche that we've created that is quite specific, and this is something that Prince and I was talking to Justin Ford on the Find Blueprints podcast about, which is that one of the things that I think is a strength of our game is that we are actually much more specific than a lot of other kinds of games with our inspiration, and I think that's what also like gives the setting some texture. So what do we think? And I think I want to ask Prince this because, Prince, you've spent a lot of time doing a lot of the nitty-gritty of the world building, so I'm curious to get your thoughts on this. Like, what have we kept from the setting itself, and like why do you think the things that we kept were interesting enough to be kept?
So I'm not actually that familiar with what we kept in the original setting. I will confess. Like I have not read the the core canon Uduasha stuff back to back, but I know that we kept the core conceit, like this well of fire in the center of the city, and also this general vibe that Uduasha is not the city of electroplasm; it is the city of pyromancy. It is the city of fire and steam and stuff. And I think that's a very cool visual. It still uses this element that you mentioned of like mad science versus the occult, but I feel like it leans more towards an occultish vibe. Fire uncontrollable. You have this great big mystic fire at the center of it all. So I think that is the main thing we kept. A lot of the other stuff we have, as far as I know, torn out and replaced. You can correct me if I'm wrong on that, but I think like the very core ideas we've kept, but not that much else, right?
Yeah, I think the things that we've kept are the idea of the huge fire at the center of the city, and the fact that the ghost field in Uduasha is very different to the ghost field in Duskwall, right? So,
oh yeah, that too. Yeah,
I think that was that's something that ended up being quite pivotal in the core book itself. That you know,
it is, and the idea there is that this burning well takes care of the ghost problem itself. It is, there's a great big sort of sacrificial fire that consumes the essences of the dead. So you have like a natural anti-ghost thing in the city, a natural thing that soaks up all the excess ghost and spiritual energy, which makes the ghost field a very different thing than it is in the default setting in Duskwall.
Yeah. We're still exploring, I think, even in the game, exactly what that means for the way that like the magical forces in Uduasha feel, right? And I think like actually the character that we see kind of most do this is Emma's character, Joan, who used to be like kind of on the front line, right, of the fight against ghosts. So Emma, do you want to tell us a little bit about like not just your character specifically, but like the idea of the Railjacks, how that fits into the setting of the world, and like how we're using that to contrast with the way that Uduasha is?
So I think a part of the conceit of the original world is that at least some of the cities that are prominent in the setting, such as Duskwall itself, are surrounded by a barrier of lightning towers. Like I imagine them like really big Tesla coils or something that have lightning sparking between them, and that's keeping the ghosts out, so that it's like a kind of controllable, livable area. But outside of those, the ghost field is truly soaked in the undead. So it would be a very dangerous place for the living to go. But still, there is an empire, there is a need in general for communication and for travel between the cities, which is for a large part achieved with these big very long train lines, train connections that, as far as I know, also cross the sea from island to island. Now, of course, there is some need for these trains to be secure, to be safeguarded, so that the rails are not constantly flooded with ghosts, which could create all sorts of problems for the trains and for the passengers. So there is a profession of people who maintain the rails and clear them of ghosts, and these people are called the Railjacks. They also travel on the trains, catching ghosts that might be in the way or getting rid of ghosts that are trying to cling to the trains. That is what was meant, I think, when you say someone who is on the front line of this undead menace that is threatening the world.
Yeah, I think the kind of a feeling of oppressive, well, maybe I shouldn't use the word oppressive because we're going to be using that word in a slightly different context. The feeling of all-pervasive dread, I think, is very present in Joan's character and backstory, and it's actually that same ever-pervasive dread to some extent that we don't have in Uduasha in the same way. We have it in a very different way, right? do you think that there is the difference in texture, which we are kind of like very aware of because we came up with it? Do you think that the people inside the world are aware of it in the same way? Do you think that the characters, not just that we play, but that inhabit Uduasha, are aware of that like wild difference?
Basically, the difference of the ghost in texture of the ghost field, or in general of just like the existence of ghosts outside the cities and inside, and absence of them inside.
I meant the latter, but now that you've asked it, I now mean both.
Right, fair enough. I imagine that they must know about the matter of ghosts. I think that is something that shows up all the time in general, like education that exists about the world, about the wider world. Even if you've never seen a ghost, you're gonna learn or read about them or hear about them at some point. I imagine it shows up in news stories when ghosts have become particularly prevalent or problematic somewhere. So yeah, I imagine that they are, that especially the people in Uduasha are at least academically aware of them, or in concept, and that this city is particularly and uniquely empty of the undead. In terms of the ghost field, though, I feel like that is something that you will only know if you've been exposed to the difference extensively, and if you're like particularly good at paying attention to it. I always imagine it as if you enter the city of Uduasha, and if you're particularly sensitive to the ghost field, you will feel as if there has been a fridge that has been buzzing the whole time. Now the sound has stopped.
Oh, that's a really, really nice way to put it. Like, it's something that you only notice when it's turned off. When it's on and you're used to it, you're like, oh, this is normal.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I think in that case, because that metaphor is so good, I'm very curious about like the ways that we built this world are actually we bounced off each other quite a lot, right? And in fact, now that you used this fridge analogy, I know that I'm going to use it going forward, right? So I'm really like, I think it's super interesting to see how we kind of built this world in a way where one person comes up with an idea, maybe even fleshes it out, and then another person just takes that and runs with it. What do we think that process kind of looks like? And I guess this is for everyone.
I think this is to me one of the things that's really beautiful about role-playing games, the fact that it is collaborative storytelling. It's something that I personally enjoy quite a lot, that I'm usually advocating for in games and stories. And I think good GMs of any role-playing game will do this already. They will sort of, usually how this goes is it goes linearly from player to GM, right? The player goes, here's my character's backstory, and then the GM weaves that into the game. But I think when you make it bi-directional, when you have this back and forth, where the player makes a backstory, then the GM weaves it into the game, then the player goes like, oh cool, maybe this setting element is tied to this and that. That's when it really sings, right? When you have this, when you're unafraid to go back and forth. And I think that's sort of what we have. So in a sense, what I'm saying is, I think every role-playing table already does this a little bit, and I'm just generally advocating doing it more.
I think that makes sense. Emma, I think like we had a moment in the first episode, or even in session 0, when we were talking about Dutch as the old language of Uduasha, right? How did we kind of like come up with that, and how is that informing the way that we are thinking about Uduasha going forward?
Yeah. So I think for my part, I still do largely approach Uduasha from the lens of like trying to translate my experiences in Bangladesh, growing up in Dhaka and so on, kind of like building a fantasy city, that as the central launching point instead of like, I don't know, Victorian London. I think for me, it's still like very much in that sort of South Asian space. However, the even though I don't normally think about the idea of like the old Uduasha language, Hadrati, being Dutch adjacent. Like I still largely see that as like something we said, and it's a bit of a joke. It's a thing in the world, but like largely it's a bit of a joke. But like I think it's still very important in a sort of like cognitive sort of sense. By which I mean is that okay, so now we are thinking about we're thinking of Uduasha, we're thinking of Dhaka, we're thinking of Kolkata, we're thinking of places like that. But the old language is Dutch. And that I think like really does two things. One, it kind of like makes this world stranger, kind of like upend certain fundamental like assumptions that you might have about it, which I think challenges the tendency to orientalize even amongst ourselves. And I think it also kind of like reminds us something that I am personally like really really invested and fascinated by. It's kind of like interconnectivity of the world, how these sorts and how like the historical places that we think of as India or England or or the Netherlands, in the real world these places are not like discrete locations that grew up by themselves and they had nothing to do with each other. In the real world there's been tons of like interplay and constantly strange things that you can't, like the word for bucket in Bengali comes from Portuguese, things like that. And I think like this sort of thing like appeals to me, and also like gives us an opportunity to like make sure that there's always like the world that we're constantly building, there's no need to like fall into some sort of like pre-assumption. There's always like more that can be odd, and that's historically justified as well, insofar as that matters.
I say I'll also add that like Dutch in this fictional world is not necessarily Dutch, right? It doesn't have to come with the connotations of Dutch, the language, IRL, and really we're not using just actual Dutch. We're taking Dutch words and kind of morphing them into something weird. So I think that does like lend a lot more to making the world feel a bit more weird, a bit more dynamic. That I think as far as the characters in this world go, like you don't even know what. It's called Udefud because that's what it's always been called, and no one really even thinks of it as being like from a different language.
Right.
Because I think that is what it is like with a lot of places in Dhaka anyway, and it does sort of relate to my experience there because a lot of the places in Dhaka have names that are from Persian, and no one thinks of it as, oh, that's what the name of this place was. It's just what it's always been called, and the reason why it's called that no longer applies. Right? Like I live in a place called Gulshan, which I think means like our garden, and if you've been to Gulshan, it's the
Rose garden.
Rose garden. Yeah, it's a rose garden. Yeah, if you've been to Gulshan, a very distinct lack of roses.
And gardens, potentially?
Yes, very distinct lack of both.
And I think this is actually fairly common across the world, right? Like you suddenly find out that like, I think I was reading something earlier today that Manchester comes from like Latin, meaning rises from the ground. It's a hill that looks like a breast, right? And now it's just Manchester. Nobody's gonna remember that's where the word came from, but everybody knows that that's what it's called, right?
Yeah, I think it's also good because in a lot of, if you do like very lazy world building, I shouldn't call it lazy. Let me do over that. In a lot of world building, people will use things like Pig Latin. They will use whatever is close at hand, like Pig Latin to sound like mysterious and occult. You'll say Latin-y sounding things. And I think there was a temptation here to just reach for Sanskrit. It's right there. And to have it be Sanskrit. But we are making this a world of our own. And we want to remind both ourselves and our listeners to not, as you said, to not like overly orientalize or overly simplify this world. So we're introducing these quirks of our own. And then I think it's funny to go for a language that is spoken today as opposed to a dead language as our dead language of the setting, kind of, to just twist it up.
I want to know what our Dutch speaker thinks of this.
I think I was about to say a lot of things that have been said. I feel like it has a tension currently the use of these two or of Dutch as a language that is very different from the languages that are in the present day of Uduasha supposed to be spoken. I feel like it has a similar tension to Akaros as a nation, which seems to have a lot of Victorian England vibes on the surface, but also has a lot of Italian-sounding words I found in the kind of implied setting in the book.
Yeah, and I think Akaros, the way that I know I've played it before, also has a lot of like kind of Russian imperial influences, which is not necessarily in the book, but it's not something the book doesn't support, right? And so there's all these different kinds of influences that allow us to reimagine even the base game, and we're kind of taking that and putting it into Uduasha as well.
Yeah, I think this is interesting what you say with like Russian or Italian, or because we play in very international context. Like this group, the games we play even outside of this podcast are with a very international and multilingual group of people, and that can actually be a challenge. Kind of because languages evoke different things to different people. So I think it's good to break with stereotypes also for that reason, because it's if everyone at the table is from the same culture, then everyone at the same table will have the same connotations to say Italian, and they will feel the same things about it. But that changes drastically if one of your players is Italian, right? So
yes, absolutely. And I think that like this is also something that we know can be sensitive, and this is something that I think that Zoheb and I have spoken about before, which is there is a kind of thinking about ownership that we don't want to necessarily accept uncritically, which is to say, in the most recent episode, Prince, you said that Vickers was going to make spam biryani, and I want to be very clear that destroyed me, that did incredible amounts of psychic damage to me, but
I'm in support.
I don't think. Yeah, exactly. Zoheb is in support of it. That's a choice that he can make for sure. But more than that, I think we want to remind ourselves that like that is the kind of choice not only that we're okay with seeing, but we even encourage seeing, right? That it's not that only someone who is from a culture that is familiar with biryani is going to, in our podcast, make statements about what that is, right? And I think that is also part of like playing with an international audience where an international group where we all trust each other, right?
We'll say that though, while I'm personally very averse to the idea of spam biryani, it is a great joke.
It's an incredible joke. I listened to it and I died laughing the second time. And a friend of mine messaged me as soon as she heard the podcast and said nothing about the rest of it, just said spam biryani, I did a triple take. So, I mean, A+, to be honest.
yeah, thank you. But I do think that this is an interesting subject, both for our listener base and our group. And there is, I think this is a sort of thing that any good group will discuss, right? You know, what do you call it? Cultural sensitivity? Is that the right word, or am I tripping over words?
I think that's
appropriation?
Maybe
something in that broad. Yeah.
I think appropriation would be if Prince starts selling spam biryani in real life and becomes famous for it, and spam biryani becomes the most popular form of biryani in the world.
Uh-huh.
I think
that
if
would
that
be
happens,
weird.
it's what we will deserve. Yeah, I think you are not wrong that it would be cultural appropriation, but it would also be what we deserve for permitting him to utter the phrase spam biryani, without censoring it. So
good.
But sorry, Prince, you were going to say?
No, nothing. Go on.
No, I was going to say that, of course, like there's a very, very funny meta joke here about how South Asians take their food very seriously, especially biryani. That we're fixating on biryani as the thing to talk about in terms of cultural respect and so on. But I think this is really important because sorry, you were going to say?
I was just going to interject that I'm from Hyderabad and we take our biryani even more seriously than most people, which is admittedly what everybody says about their biryani.
Fair enough. Biryani is very good.
not biryani more seriously than us.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Then me specifically.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
They call me the biryani ustad, where I come
Mhm.
from.
Yes, this can spin out forever.
Yes, that's
I'll
true.
let
And
it
it
go
can
forward.
only work well.
Maybe we should move on to the next topic.
I will say though, on the subject of cultural sensitivity, I think look,
Mhm.
this is the kind of joke that it's okay to make. I mean, depending on where you're coming from, right? Like if it comes, you can make this joke in one of two ways. One is a kind of ignorant kind of way and that could be insensitive, but the other way you can make it, and I think that's the way the Prince is doing it, is almost like an affectionate parody, right? And that's great. Like that makes for a very good joke when you know what you're talking about and intentionally adding something weird to it.
I think it's also metronymic of like the larger sort of problem that we were almost trying to address with when Tree and I first started talking about like making more content for Uduasha or Iruvia, making some sort of supplement, maybe making Iruvian playbooks, and then we eventually landed on the podcast idea, where I think like fundamentally the problem with how unsatisfying the Uduasha content and the treatment of Iruvia is in the Blades manual. I think fundamentally it comes down to the fact that it's very much from that outsider looking in perspective that we call Orientalism. And it's interesting because when we start talking about the podcast and the idea of the podcast, Tri and I, we spoke about whether or not like we talked about it as like a South Asian podcast, a brown people podcast essentially, right? And then we discussed it and it's like, do we actually want to just make a show where it's just a bunch of South Asians playing Blades in a very South Asian in jokey kind of way, and where the assumed audience is South Asian, and like there's different ways of talking about this kind of thing. I mean, safe space may not be inappropriate, though of course that's a very loaded term. And we thought about this, and I don't, I can't speak for Tree here, like, but I personally felt very kind of uncomfortable with that sort of idea, right? But at the same time, like, if the sort of problem that we're trying to address here, content-wise, is an outcome of a lack of familiarity, sort of like outsiders looking in, then there's a sort of like obvious tension there of like not making a product that's entirely insiders speaking. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I don't necessarily have an answer there beyond that. We chose to kind of like mix. And I think it's interesting because of that. But I think it's also the sort of decision that comes with a certain degree of risk, which is not necessarily a problem.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I was thinking about was precisely because we're such an international group that I wanted one of the things to be that even if I wasn't personally comfortable with going some places, that the group should be fine with it and I should be able to trust the group with that, right? And I think Spam Biryani is a nice example in that it's not really that serious, of course, but it's the kind of thing where because there is a group and because the table is comfortable with it, then I can be comfortable with it, even though I might, in some other contexts, not even utter these words because they are blasphemy against the one true God. And I think, like, broadly, and I just want to move to kind of like the themes of the podcast, because we could really genuinely talk about this one thing forever, I think, is how we kind of like came up with the things we wanted to see and the things we wanted to tackle, right? So, like Klow said, the Uduasha content was a jumping off point. But I think more broadly, one of the things we decided, I think, very early on was that we wanted to see a kind of family dynamic, right? And our characters are all like kind of related to each other and are related to the institution of the temple, right? So the Bonda family, I think, runs very strongly at the core of our game. So I'm wondering, like, how did you think of each of your characters in relation to that theme? Like, how did you decide this is where my character will kind of fit in?
I would like Miraz to start, or Klow to start with Miraz here, if I may nominate someone.
There's a few things that I wanted to address with Miraz as a character, but like thinking of family for the moment. So I am personally, well, I suppose there's no reason not to get a bit personal. Like, I am one of those. I'm one of the many South Asians who went abroad to the West to get educated and started making a life there. And I think that is an experience that particular kind of immigrant experience is very interesting. That's the one that I wanted to like look into with Miraz, where it's like you're from a certain place, but maybe you never fully felt that you belonged there in the first place. Then you went somewhere else. And I think Miraz is far less critical than I am in real life. But you went somewhere else and then you felt like you belonged. And then where are you then? Right? Like you don't fully belong in the new place, you don't fully belong in the old place. And then Miraz is a character who had to come back home to take up responsibilities that he's probably unfit for. At least as far as he's concerned, he's unfit for. And I think no one really expected him to take up the mantle. But he has to do it, right? And then how does he handle like life with his family, like with his new perspective? How does he handle life in his old town, which he never probably felt like was ever his place to begin with? That kind of thing. I think that's a very interesting and difficult immigrant experience, which I wanted to like highlight. Does that answer the question for now?
Yeah, and I do want to add here that, like, I do not have exactly that experience, but have a similar experience, which is to say that I did go to England to become educated, and then I came running back. And whether that is a good decision or not remains to be seen. And I think a lot of the way that I imagine Zajidan's relationship with Miraz, which I'm actually like very careful about in many ways, is I think influenced both by your and my history of that, right? And I think I'm very careful to kind of say Zajidan is a good father, and he's much more put together than many South Asian parents are, or many parents are even. And he is kind and caring, but this doesn't mean that he has not made some missteps, and it doesn't mean that he's perfect, right? And I think that relationship between Zajidan and Miraz is something that we really see your and my personal struggles in, which I find like very interesting.
Can I propose we go on with Zajidan's brother as our next?
Yes.
So yeah, I'm playing Abbas, Miraz's uncle. Got the most experience around the temple, and is a sort of ex-spy of a Islamic scholar. And for this character, I guess there were like two sort of things that I had in the back of my mind when making this character. One was I'd read a book not too long ago on the development of science in the medieval Islamic world, and I really liked that book. And this book had a lot of excerpts from what the scientists at the time, there were direct translations of what the scientists at the time wrote, and I really liked the way that they were going about their way they were doing science, and it's kind of hard to explain now, but a lot of the times when someone is writing a book and it's a response to something someone else had written, there was this level of snarkiness, because we're not talking about modern day, publications and stuff, right? If someone would write something like, "Oh, well, such and such has written this on this theory," I would advise him to consider. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and I don't know, there was something about just like that kind of character that I really connected with, and so Abbas the nucleus of Abbas is sort of there, and then as I think I've been playing him, he's taken on some characteristics of my real life uncles, and there's a little bit of me in there as well. How could there not be? but also with Abbas as a sort of counterpoint to Miraz, I think, is that I'm also someone who's South Asian who's gone abroad to study and has then made a new life abroad. But even like while the place where I've grown up, which is Dhaka, Bangladesh, is objectively a terrible place to be, I've always had affection for this place, and someone would say a very irrational affection for the place, but it's there. And the longer that I've spent away from Dhaka, the more I miss it, and maybe like I feel like maybe I need to perhaps defend or like speak up for the place where I've grown up, and a little bit of that I think is also in Abbas as well. Like he's there as an advocate for his way of life, right? Like his city, like he loves it, warts and all, and that's something that's coming from my own experiences.
I think one of the things I like about Abbas also is that he's very much more comfortable, like you say, in his city compared to Miraz and Joan and Vickers, because he's kind of like been there for so long. He's practically part of the architecture, right? And I think the other three characters in the crew are kind of caught between worlds, and that is their challenge. Whereas for Abbas, it's like the challenge is in fact becoming more caught between the worlds, because he's so comfortable in the place that he's found himself that leaving it has now become something that he maybe needs to do, right?
One of the things I will say is that with Abbas, I'm not like a method actor or anything like that. A lot of the times I've just been winging it with what his opinions on things are, and so it's hard for me to give an exact kind of motivation for something like that. But I think it is just that is I wanted to relay my experiences of living in Dhaka and feeling like this is a place that I know well. I know the people there, and especially, so this is a very long time ago, but when I was until I was about 11 or 12, something like that, I lived in what was essentially a kind of gated community. So one of my relatives was in the army, and because through of that connection, we were able to get a place in a place that was for military officers and their relatives. But it was still connected to. It was in an odd place where it's kind of like a place for middle class families, but it's also bang in the middle of like a very working class, very like gritty part of the town with a rail line going through it, like, very like old markets that just a jumble of maze of streets and all that. And I guess maybe the city was safer back then, but I would just, as a child, just walk around these places pretty much by myself. I would just after in the afternoon, I'd just leave home. I would come back sometime in the evening, and no one in my family would question where I'd gone. I knew everyone in the neighborhood, and that is a feeling that has been missing in where I live now, which is Toronto. Because I think of the way the city is built, it's not the kind of city planning that in most places in the city, not the kind of place that promotes these communal ties. And yeah, I think I've been maybe a little subconsciously been kind of trying to play that up as well. My character lives in the city, he knows everyone, he's really comfortable, right? And maybe it's my way of getting back some of that, living some of these memories.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. In that case, I think maybe the next person we should move to is Vickers, who is not from Uduasha, and I don't actually know where Prince lives. I know he lives in Sweden, but I don't know where in Sweden you live, Prince. So I'm curious to know whether the way that Soup is describing the way that Toronto is similar to your experience of where you are, or whether that's different.
Yeah. So I come from a small town, and then I left, and that's I did not have. I was the kind of person who grew up and wanted to get out, right? And had initially planned to move further away, which has very little bearing on Vickers as a character, really. But I feel like we have sort of different backgrounds, right? And I don't really recognize this sort of being part of a city is not something that I have experienced in the same way. I don't think I'm not. I wanted to leave where I grew up, but I never really had that feeling of being entirely a city person or entirely at home in a city either. I don't think. And Vickers is not very much colored by that. So Vickers, the reason why I'm in this role about the family ties, if we go back to the original question, right? In a different game, there was a character who had an ex-wife that became like a big NPC thing off screen. And I thought it would be funny in that game if I were to step in and have the ex-wife be my next PC after my player was like, my character was like lost in Vice or off screen. So I decided to step in and play the ex-wife. And then that became a bit of a meme or in-joke in the server I'm on. Or the server we're on, I should say. And yeah, from there on, I was like, maybe I should play the wife again. I had fun with it the first time. And so that's how the Vickers concept came about. But I think Vickers is totally different. I think that she is the sort of person who's comfortable in any kind of environment and aggressively adapts to her surroundings, or doesn't really adapt but thinks that she does. And I think that's where a lot of that character comes from. So Vickers is from a noble family. She's from the Ashcroft family of Akoros. She is a complete outsider in Uduasha, and I think a lot of the comedy comes from her being a complete outsider, and I'm trying to play off of that. But she also, is well-meaning and really tries to fit in. And to highlight or to look at where Vickers comes from and what sort of differences are driving her is that not only is she not from Uduasha, she's also nobility. She comes from a fairly penniless family called the Ashcrofts, who are, they have status and prestige in their home country, and they're desperately clinging to that status and prestige here in Uduasha. They're trying to maintain their power and their influence and pulling strings and so on. But I think there's definitely this interesting clash of wills here, which is really what all the Vickers concept is about. So the Ashcrofts they used to own a fleet of ships. Now they work on an airship in Uduasha, so they represent this kind of industrial force that is casting its shadow over Uduasha, and it's making a lot of people like Abbas quite uncomfortable. So her father is the leader of the empire, and also Miras's rival, and then she has a sister who is competing with her for the inheritance, essentially. This is sort of how that theme ties into Vickers. And the noble families of Akoros, where she comes from, are, for people not familiar with the setting, they are very, very big deals in Akoros. They basically own all the industries, they run everything. They're basically somewhere in between noble houses and mega corporations. And so I think Vickers' storyline is not really escaping from a culture so much as it is escaping that oppressive regime of family, right? She comes from a family that is like a corporation, like a machine. And then she's married into this messy but genuinely loving family. And I think that's the interesting contrast in her storyline.
Something that I really enjoy about Vickers is that you can see all of the tension that she has on one side towards her sister, towards her father, and so on. And then you can see that the way that she's integrating into the Chakrabortis is, I mean, it's not easy, and, there's a lot of work on all sides, but there isn't this sense of like complicated suspicion and mistrust on everyone's part, right?
No, indeed.
Which I think there is in the Ashcrofts.
Yeah, and we also have we have the themes of family, and we have this theme of like cultures crossing as well. So that's why I think it's very cool that we have this marriage of two characters from completely different backgrounds, and there's a lot of interesting stories to tell just by how their backgrounds meet and clash.
Yeah,
in forms
absolutely.
of Miras's conflict with the Ashcroft family and so on.
I just wanted to jump in and note one of the things that I really like about how we're handling this storyline is that so far, like, we have done the fish out of water stuff, but like it hasn't been like har, she doesn't know to handle life here. Har, funny cultural misunderstandings, haha, bend it like Beckham, etc. It's something I appreciate.
Yes.
Yeah. And to draw on real world experiences, this is something I am marrying into a family from a different culture than my own. So this is something that I have some real world experience of as well.
Another thing that I really like about Vickers is that the genuine earnestness is, I think, something that we in the real world, or at least I have kind of seen that like there's a kind of suspicion of that. Not necessarily because the person themselves doesn't mean well, but because we've kind of seen it go wrong so often, right? But because we get to fictionalize this relationship, we don't need to involve that. So we can just see the earnestness itself and then think about, okay, what does that mean, right? Like when someone is genuinely like interested in learning something new, but is unfamiliar with that thing, like what kinds of consequences do we see from that, right? And that is something that I think we don't really in the real world get to see enough of, because there's always history, right? And by removing that history, I think we get to examine this, which I'm enjoying very much.
Yeah, there's also a world building note of that Uduasha and Akuros's relationship is complicated, right? This is explicitly not a world, and we've mentioned this before. It's not that Uduasha is colonized by the Empire, right? There is an uneasy kind of maybe an unequal power balance, but there is some sort of power balance between them. Uduasha is its own city, and Iruvia has a consulate. It's very unclear actually in the default world building exactly what the relationship is. They're sort of part of the empire, but they also have a consulate and their own government. So it's a messy relationship between the two cultures, which is something that also comes up as we world build Uduasha a fair bit.
Yeah, jumping on that, I was sort of thinking of it as a bit like the Persian Empire in 19th century kind of thing, where the Qajar dynasty, the Persia was never colonized, but the royal family were, in return for some kickbacks from European powers, would essentially contract away bits of their economy, and that's where all the trouble started. And I think it's a bit like I was thinking it's a bit like that, where this is independent, it's not colonized or conquered, but there is clearly a power imbalance, and rather than resist, the powers that be in Uduasha have decided to collaborate with accuracy interests, sometimes to the detriment of the actual Uduasha, the Iruvian people.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a theme in Blades in the Dark in general that economics is the darkest art, right?
Yeah.
On the other hand, I think we're also seeing what we really see come up in this story a lot is Akaros as a cultural hegemon, effectively. So it doesn't necessarily have to conquer places to influence them and change them into a mirror of itself.
Right.
There is a tension that there is the possibility that Akaros is kind of doing that with Uduasha. Of course, calling them Akaros and Uduasha as actors is a very nebulous concept, because we are already seeing that people from both sides are kind of or both cultures are kind of contributing to that process.
One thing that I find really interesting in Blades in the Dark, and it's something that I would like to see explored more explicitly, I think, in a lot of the games a lot of the, I don't know, the paratext, like all the stuff that people talk about, like, because Blades is now bigger than just the manual, right? It's been, what, 5 years? But like one of the things that I find really interesting as an implication in Blades in the Dark in terms of how the Empire works is that unlike in the real world where, okay, like there's a bit of a metaphor. What I'm trying to get at is, unlike in the real world, where places like England and the Netherlands and the US now essentially exert their hegemony over foreign lands, and largely for economic reasons. There is sort of like a rhetoric of, like, a civilizing mission, right? Like back in the day it was Christianity, nowadays it's democracy. Yes, this episode is now becoming very, very political, and we shall keep going forward.
Has now become. We started at Orientalism in the base text.
Yeah.
I think.
Unavoidable, given what we're trying to explore in this in this campaign. So.
Yeah.
Yep.
But like, so that's real world empires, right? Like economic juggernauts with some sort of like veneer of some sort of like rationalization. So because no one really wants to say we're going to go over there and we're going to suck up all their oil. We're going to go over there and like make them bleed for indigo, that kind of thing. But I find Blades really interesting because like this is a post-apocalyptic setting where there's an immortal emperor who, okay, some people say that this is all propaganda, etc. But like he's probably immortal. Magic probably does exist. Magic exists. He seems to have some sort of method of keeping the ghosts out. So Akaros, his empire, it actually does have some sort of like actual justification that real world empires don't have. And I think that's really interesting in terms of like what would that actually do for a world? What would that actually do for the people who are the colonizers? What would that do for an empire? What would that do for its subjects? Like this notion of like the state that's being built is the only form of like civilization that can survive. And I think that rhetoric also is really, really interestingly problematized by the fact that the manual also says that the Daggerails, they have their own method of dealing with ghosts. Severosis, they have ancient societies where they also know how to deal with ghosts. Uduasha is built around a gigantic flame pit that sucks up all the spirits. So even though the rhetoric there implies that, okay, the Empire is the only way to live, we know that the Empire is not the only way to live. And I think there's really interesting tensions that can come up politically if you like approach it with these lenses, where the Empire seems to have a reason to exist that real world empires don't have, but then also at the same time there's other ways of living that are in the base text already.
Yeah, I also think we see that not only do we see in the manual that there are alternative ways of dealing with ghosts other than what is said to be like the Emperor's mandate, effectively. We've also seen that the Emperor's mandate has already collapsed because in the past, in the history of Akaros, they were able to ward off ghosts simply by his magic. But now they're not able to do that anymore, and they need the lightning barriers.
Which requires an industrial system of exploitation and so on to support it.
Exactly. I think the counterpoint to what you're saying is that yes, they have this emperor who provides a thing that is really necessary, arguably, but that also means that the cultural hegemon provides something that is really necessary by means of extracting and controlling a viscous black liquid, which is not all that unlike the real world, right?
Yeah.
So
exactly. So there's metaphors and so on, but like I think there is a core of necessity or like justification that I think is really interesting to play on.
Yeah.
Because of course that is not ultimately justifiable or necessary, as we find out in the text.
Yeah. And I think, in fact, because we were going through characters, so I do want to pull Emma into this. But this is such an interesting topic, so I'm going to try and tie them both together. So Emma, Joan is a character who is explicitly kind of running away from the things that Akaros is doing in order to like maintain its supremacy, right? So she was employed by that infrastructure. She was very good at that job, and then she found herself needing to leave and needing to find like a sanctuary, right? how do you think that kind of tension of that past interacts? Because everyone else kind of has a somewhat complicated relationship, which ultimately I think puts them on the side against Akaros. For Vickers, it's the fact that her family is trying to, regain its imperial status. For Miraz and Abbas, it's the fact that their temple is staunchly Iruvian. But it seems like for Joan, one way or another, you can't deny that fighting ghosts is kind of a good thing.
Yeah. I think when we first started talking about this podcast, and this is starting with a bit of a tangent, I was very quickly very sure that I didn't want to play someone who was from Uduasha or had always been a part of this family in the way that, for instance, Abbas is. Also because I am extremely unfamiliar with most of the cultures that Uduasha is based on or inspired on. So I was that would not be bringing a part of me into that character. That would feel untrue somehow. So I knew I was going to play someone who was more from this fictional setting's imperial core, effectively. She's from Scotland. That's not Akros, but you see that those countries are very close to each other in, for instance, the fact that Duskwall was originally a Scotlander city. And as you say, she is employed effectively in the most physical and most literal manifestation of the empire's influence or method of spreading influence. That being those railways and keeping them clear of ghosts. But it turns out that's a pretty stressful job. Who could have thought, right? To fight manifestations of grief and rage of the dead all the time when there is no sun atop a speeding rail car. Turns out that kind of drains you after some time. So she has to go somewhere else. She has to stop living that particular life. And there I think she makes the choice to look towards a different culture as a means of escape or personal salvation. It's interesting that escape comes up in all our characters, almost, it seems. Where she thinks, I'll go to this place that she perceives as really far away and completely unlike the world that I've lived in. And I think she goes to be a religious. She goes into a religious position, right? I think that she will also have thought of it as a more peaceful or spiritual place than where she was from. And then that I think that's a thing that we might see with a lot of a number of real people in Western cultures that look at other countries and think, oh, that's a more spiritual place. It's a different place. It's a place where I can live a life completely unlike the one that I'm living now. So that was a theme that I was very interested in exploring. Now, of course, there's some kind of fantasy or narrative add-ons to that in the actual story that we have. So, for instance, Uduasha is not a place that has ghosts, where she is running very, very concretely from the life with ghosts in them. And we made the narrative choice to have her have another reason that Uduasha was on her radar and that this temple was on her radar is that she is very distantly related to the rest of the cast. But I think I deliberately made that a little bit of a tenuous connection, because ultimately we see her running to Uduasha thinking that her life will be completely different and that she will be at peace. But once she has arrived and the campaign starts, we see that for a very large part, none of that is really working out exactly as she had thought.
Yeah. And I think this is a good time to bring up like how we kind of came up with the cult itself, right? Because I think one of the things I was certainly very keen on was that there should not be one single easily identifiable thing, right? Like it's going to be a wheel that's also a snake that's also on fire, right? Maybe the snake is real, maybe it's the god, maybe it's the avatar of the god, we're not sure. And then each person in the cast has a very different relationship to that institution, right? But I think Joan actually has maybe the most, I wouldn't say the most personal, but the most immediate in some ways relationship with the institution, because Joan is actually very comfortable around the snake that is the avatar of the god, and certainly seems to be the god itself, right? But we've also been seeing that the god sometimes just does whatever it wants. Yeah, so like Joan has this very immediate kind of relationship in this way, but everybody does have something very different, and we are seeing the way that the god is basically sometimes pushing its own agenda without necessarily taking into account the things that like the characters want or its devotees want, right? And so far that tension hasn't necessarily bubbled up into outright conflict, and we don't know if it will, but that's something that I think I'm very interested in, because like we said that we were talking about this before we were recording, which is the difference between heresy and orthodoxy, and how you require a heretic almost in order to be orthodox, right? You need someone to stand up and say the god is wrong in order for your belief in the god to be affirmed. So I guess the question is, where do we think our characters' relationships with that institution kind of came from? And like more broadly, how are we thinking about religion in Uduasha, which I think all of us like have a different take on, and that's kind of why it has like so much texture in the game.
With any religion, like there's going to be a diversity of opinions, and I think it's really good that we are capturing all of that. And now I only have intimate a relationship with one religion, but this is something that like even in I think a fairly short span of people, there's a lot of different ways of I think living their religion, right? And that's something that is coming across, and something that I think we've all kind of wanted to emphasize. And for Abbas, I think his way of living the precepts of his religion is more to do with his scholarly work. Like he's a kind of person who thinks that the best way is to to learn about the history and have like these debate. Like he's Abbas is strangely like this another something that I noticed, and I wanted to bring in this character is paradoxically both very conservative but also progressive, where in the sense that I think like he thinks that like he like he's done a lot of studying, right? And he's firmly in the belief that he's got it right. And so if people just listen to him, everything would be fine. Where I think with Joan, the relationship is more spiritual, right? It's more about I think like doing the rituals. And sorry, I think I lost the thread of what I was saying.
That's so Abbas.
That is so
Hashtag
Abbas.
that's so Abbas.
Someone else jump in here.
Maybe it's the feeling I get for like the difference between Joan and Abbas and their relationship to the god is that Joan is very much there for the god specifically because she thinks that just holding to its precepts and focusing on something that is not worldly, that is divine, that will be her salvation. Whereas I see Abbas being more like being about the philosophy of the thing first, and therefore also having maybe a bit more room to disagree with the snake.
Yeah, that's pretty much I think what I was going for.
Yeah, I also want to point out that our intro says that the inhabitants are a family, a god, and the snake. So the snake and the god are not necessarily one and the same thing. In precisely the same that the way that the family and the god have the same name but are not necessarily the same thing. It's the Chakraborty family, and that's also the name of the deity. But there are differences here.
Maybe it'll turn out the snake is just some random snake. There's a snake.
The kinds of things I'm thinking about with regard to the snake do not bear going into because I will never stop, and none of it will be canon until it appears in the.
Fair enough. Surprise us.
Yeah.
But since we're talking about our relationships to the religion, I think Miraz is interesting in this respect because he's ambivalent. I think ambivalent is the kindest way to put it. He largely doesn't care about the family religion at all. I think he's spent most of his life trying to avoid it. He grew up in it, obviously, but like it never really particularly appealed to him. It's a little bit like being an atheist, but also God exists in your basement. It's like
God exists in your basement has to be the name of this episode, by the way. But please go on.
But it's like because God exists in your basement, maybe you don't find him particularly interesting or convincing. It's just like, yeah, snake runs around, does weird snake shit. My dad's into it. Whatever. I'm going to go off and learn something much more interesting, like mad science, which is Imperial approved and so on. So now he's back though, and as far as he's concerned, the cult is just some millstone around his neck that he has to like put up with, whereas he could be doing much more interesting things. Of course, that's also complicated by the fact that he's unemployed and doesn't actually have a Sparkcraft job. So he probably wouldn't be doing interesting things anyway. But let's just ignore that for a minute. But like, coupled with the fact that he doesn't really care about this religion, which of course like totally exists, like, you know, the god is physically present. It's not like a real world religion. Where he's like not convinced by the family religion, but like still has to like do the job because now he's the head priest. The other thing about that is that he has an almost like petty need to still do the job, to still be okay. Like, okay, I don't want to be the high priest, but I am the high priest. So, shut up, Uncle Abbas, that kind of thing. And like, I think there's also a degree of like resentment towards Joan for clearly being the one who's like most favored by the snake, whatever that would eventually become. And like he has this kind of need to like show that, you know, he's important and he's going to be involved. I'm not super sure where that's coming from, but it's there. And I think like throughout all of this, I have not described any sort of like religious awe or any actual desire to do good and so on. It's just like very, very petty human like relationships towards this religion, which I think is actually a fairly interesting and very commonplace and mundane way in which a lot of people perform religiosity.
Yeah, and I think it's also pretty interesting because it is like such an interesting juxtaposition where it seems like the god itself has chosen someone apathetic to believing in it, that this person should be the person who leads the religion and takes it forward and so on, right? So that's really like in some ways it's quite funny. In fact, I think in that case let's talk more broadly about like religion in Uduasha, because not only do gods exist in your basement, do you also know that there are demons who live in towers? ? This is something that like in the base game, I know, Klow, you feel very strongly about, because the whole thing about, you know, there are demons that live in the east and like they roam the streets is like the most classic Orientalist kind of trope, right? And I think we didn't want to take that away in some sense, because demon princes are just like the phrase demon prince in my mind just evokes something that's very fun. but at the same time, I think we wanted to kind of really change that up. So one of the things that we did was in the base book there are 4 demon houses, but we created a 5th one.
This was inspired, by the way, by something Emma said. I forget exactly, but like something about like the 4 pillars being like the fingers of a hand, and then why not have a 5th finger?
Popularly known as a thumb, yes. What is also very funny about this is that now I'm imagining a thumb, which is not. I mean, anyway, we don't need to go into why I find that funny.
You're just thinking about a thumb. It's fine.
I'm just thinking about a thumb. It's fine.
Why is there an awkward pause?
But yeah, no, sorry. Yeah, what I was gonna say was, the reason there was an awkward pause was that I was thinking, well, I came up with some of this stuff, but I don't want to be like, this is why I came up with it. So, how do we feel about like some of the ways that we've kind of rediscovered the lore, right? That like in the base game there are these massive comets that have turned up somehow, and everybody knows that happened before the Immortal Emperor was ever the Immortal Emperor, and after that happened, Uduasha came into being as it is known today, right? So how are we thinking about working and also reworking that stuff in our game?
So I think on a very basic level, it's a fun challenge. You have the parameters for the world that someone else made, and you, in a very petty way, perhaps, it is a bit petty. I think we have justifications for them beyond pettiness, but we don't like Uduasha as written. So I think very much there's this sense of like we can do a better job, which apologies to John Harper if he ever ends up listening to this. But like it's still really fun to like work within the constraints of certain things, certain creative decisions that someone made, while disagreeing with the overall arc of their project and then kind of trying to do better. It's an interesting challenge, and I had fun with that. There's that basic level thing that was going on throughout, I think, the decisions of like what to keep, what to leave out. But like, so part of what I find interesting about what we did is that when you look at Uduasha as it is in the Blade Special Edition, which I think is like it's got 4 or 5 districts, it's a fairly they're in that fleshed out. It feels like a city that can tell like 2, maybe 3 different kinds of stories. Whereas Dustwall, there's just so many stories. Like I'm constantly coming up with like stories that you can explore in this setting. Like what about Barrowcliff Mafia, right? What about like cult assassins and so on? There's so many things you can do in Dustwall because it's big, it's detailed, but it's also got a lot of like blank space. Which I don't think Uduasha in the Blade Special Edition has. And I think like as we kind of like did our own world building, we consciously or otherwise also made this big sprawling city that is too big for our current campaign. And I think that's fine, right? There's so many elements in there that we probably will not come across. But like one of the things that I find really interesting is that even though we are a cult, most of our dealings so far have been with sport, with civic bureaucracy, that kind of thing. And there's crime, but like it's a bit lighthearted crime, There's a big mafia agency there's a big mafia group that essentially pushes drugs and so on, and that's a fairly dark theme, but it hasn't gotten dark in our story yet. But there's potential there for like someone to play Uduasha in a really, really gritty, dark drug dealer sort of story with like lots of colonialist themes and so on in our world building. But like there's potential there as well. And I'm circling back to the initial point of like what we have kept from the book. What I found really fascinating and also not very well done in the original base Uduasha is the Udu itself. This big burning fire at the heart, which is a cool concept. Then there's like this area around it that's like really magical and freakish and so on. And I can't really explain it, but like there was just something about the way it was written that like never really captured my heart. because I felt
Right.
like it was like so over the top Orientalist. All sorts of magic, like shadow. It's like shadowy figures, strange sorcerers, and so on. But when we world built Uduasha out and we added like a district that's entirely about bureaucracy, right? We have a district that's got like 2 different refugee communities and so on, and it becomes bigger, far bigger than the sort of like skullduggery Iruvian shadow place with like demon princes. Then it becomes really interesting to have the Udu, to like not change that much, to kind of like have the Udu as a district and like concentrate on the magic, because the story that we are telling is so far removed from that core. It's really interesting to know that somewhere in the heart of this city you still have that strange, mysterious, okay, maybe Orientalist district still there, maybe even stranger than it appeared in the book. And I think that becomes interesting because that's not the city as a whole anymore, but like some place that should feel very weird and feral.
Yeah, and I think feral is a good word there because it is. That's kind of like we like the feralness of it. What we don't necessarily like is the way that feralness is portrayed without other things existing kind of as well, right? But I'm curious to hear everyone else's thoughts on that, because I think, yeah, we've all got feelings.
I am curious because for me, the feeling of like the kind of Orientalist implications of the Urdu itself have been substantially changed, even though we haven't changed it that much, by changing the context of the city and making that the city itself a much more human place, I would say.
Right.
Does that ring true for you?
I would say definitely. Like it comes back to what Aadiyat was saying at the start, where Uduasha now feels like a city where that is organic, that you could actually expect it to. It feels like a real place.
It feels dynamic. Like I think we have also tried to emphasize that is that things are on the move. Where I think in the special edition it felt a bit static. Like it felt like, and I think that sort of does also lead into Orientalism, just more broadly, where Orientalist depictions of these places are as places that are static, that are unchanging. Like they've always been this way, and they'll always be this way unless we do something about it. But yeah, I think the world that we built here, on top of what was there, is one that's more. The internal mechanisms of Uduasha are moving things along.
Yeah. I think the other thing that like I at least find very interesting about the way that we're approaching some of this is that the immigrant populations, which don't exist in the base book, but like we're all kind of interested in immigration as a phenomenon for one reason or another, is that because of that also makes the city feel very different and lived in, right? How did the idea of like putting these two, and there's two different immigrant populations, they're both refugees, then there's the immigrant population of the cultural hegemon, which are in the imperial quarter, and then there's the broader kind of like immigrants from other parts of Iruvia in the city. How did that kind of like come about, and like how do we envision that kind of also opening up the city?
Let's just briefly have a note here because we have mentioned like the 2 refugee populations and we have not actually featured one of them. So I'll just briefly
Yes, that is true.
get the listener up to speed. So there's the Skovlander refugees from the war, like the same situation in Dustfall, but I thought it was really interesting to have like the same number of Skovlanders coming to Uduasha, or maybe even more. Which I think makes a lot more sense because like Uduasha didn't invade Skovland, so it would make sense for them to come to Uduasha. So there's that population, but also there's this place in Iruvia on the map on the base game called Kethris, and I thought it'd be really interesting to have like a lot of farmers and so on getting displaced from Kethris because of like imperial agricultural techniques and so on. So now they're in Uduasha, essentially jobless. So not really refugees. They aren't fleeing a war. They're just displaced farmers and so on. But they're in the same place as the Scotlanders, and I think that's an interesting tension to have like two large groups of people who need help, and they're very different, and they have different grievances.
I think the immigrant thing also ties into what Soap was saying before about the dynamicness of Uduasha as well. Because the truth is, if we're talking about this as a parallel to modern cities that we have lived in and visited and so on, right? Then, in reference to what Aadiyat was saying before about the dynamicness of the setting, of it being not a static and unchanging place, I think we are also talking about Uduasha as a parallel to worlds that we have lived in and visited, which is to say modern, South Asian and modern cities that are alive and vibrant. And in the modern world, it is the case that there is this amount of exchange of cultures and people moving back and forth, and very, very few cities today, I would argue almost no big cities, are completely culturally homogeneous. So this heterogeneity is, I think, a good topic to explore, and it is something we have in the setting. We have these displaced farmers, we have the Skovland refugees, and then we also have like the rich, basically we have what is in the parlance, right? We have both the immigrants and the expats, basically just down to how much money they have. And I think that's a good thing to reflect in the story, because it makes it more contemporary. That is, it's not even that it's contemporary, it's probably to a degree always been like this, but it's a more realistic depiction of a modern city, which will have both an influx of the rich and the poor. So that was what I want to say.
Even as I was talking about the immigrant populations, that's when I went, wait a second, the Imperial Quarter is also literally full of immigrants. We're just like so used to not thinking of expatriates as immigrants.
Yeah.
So that's pretty. I think that's a theme that I really enjoy.
Speaking on about immigrants, one of the things that I was really interested in seeing, and still am, and I think we have seen it so far more or less, but like Uduasha in the base again, like I don't know, I think now we're just kind of like beating a dead horse, but or punching someone who's down. Uduasha in the base manual, it's like I think it's actually explicitly homogeneous. Like I think there's actually a part where it says that there's not that many kinds of different people here, which I found very silly and I didn't like at all. And I think like we've kind of gone out of our way to like not just have Uduasha, then we have the people from Kethris, just to show that Uduasha is not the same as other places in Iruvia. They're different. They have their own cultures, and now they're here. There's a distinct immigrant population. That's Iruvian, but not Uduashan. That's important. With the Scotlanders, you have the Imperials, of course, who are an immigrant population. They don't really fit in. They don't really belong. They're trying to figure out how that works. But aside from that, you also have like the other people from the Empire. You have the Dagger Islanders here, so far represented via the Hive, but like there's others. You have the Severosis. I don't know at what order we'll be uploading all of this, but the Silver Nails have appeared, the Severosis. There's Tychros is in the world building. We haven't seen them yet, but like this is really important. Like having all these different cultures that are in this world, in this base setting, being here in this megalopolis, right? Megapolis. Being here in this megapolis. Yes. Because why wouldn't they be? And I think that's a really interesting counter to like the sort of like orientalization of like places as being not changing, or places as being like much less diverse over there, right?
I mean, again, like we have a lot of historic precedent to work for something like this, because places like Delhi during the Mughal period, or like in any of these other major cities, were very cosmopolitan, and of course they were, because it's a rich place. It's a place where everything's happening, and so people from nearby countries, kingdoms, whatever, will come to get a piece of the pie, or come for refuge, or whatever it is.
Yeah, and I think this is also something that we see reflected in, and I'm bringing this in because it's one of the favorite things that I love about our game, and I just keep forgetting to like bring it up until like the very end, which is we also see this diversity in the way that everybody plays roofball.
Yes.
It's very clear that like it is a kind of like global sport. Everybody plays it, but at the same time, everyone plays it very differently. The cultures of playing it are so different, and we recently had the roofball match where like the Skovlander team played our team, and there was a very clear, I think, divide in many respects, right? And I think that the diversity showing up in that is also something that like I find very interesting, because the World Cup is going on as we speak, right?
Yeah.
And we see these teams play each other. Arguably the sport is the same, but the cultures of playing the sport can be so different.
I totally didn't realize we were able to bank on World Cup fever for our marketing.
Oh yes.
Excellent.
Well,
Come for the
I
roofball.
only yeah. Yeah.
Indeed.
Come for
I
the
think-
roofball, stay for the family drama.
Oh man, that should really be our tagline, to be honest. Like our unofficial tagline, because that's what our game is. Come for the roofball, stay for the family drama, right?
If I may be allowed a small diversion, speaking of different cultures around people playing the same sport, which is football or soccer, depending on which part of the world you're listening from, in the World Cup. On Friday, I went to this food court where they were showing the England versus the US, and I was surrounded by some US football fans who asked some very interesting questions about the sport, such as one guy going, "It's funny how that works, that like everyone else has to use their head, but one guy can use his hands. Like, what's that about?" So, yeah.
Yeah.
Really
It's funny
wonderful.
how that works.
Yeah. So very different sporting cultures indeed.
Yeah. I think like one of the reasons that I really like roofball in our game is that we are all like fans of sport in very different ways. I know Aadiyat is a football fan. I am a football adjacent fan. I'm a huge tennis fan. I watch a lot of tennis. And I don't know whether the rest of us, Emma, Prince, and Zoheb, whether you watch or follow sport very closely, but I think the enthusiasm for roofball also comes partially from the ability to project onto this fictional Calvin Ball-esque sport our feelings for real sport, whether those are positive or negative.
Yeah, so roofball, just to explain it, or roofball is, as you say, Calvin ball. It's a made-up sport, and it's made up by the Blades in the Dark community. It's grown out as this kind of meme in the community, and it's very fun, I think, to incorporate a sport where we can be flexible about exactly what it means and do some sports drama, but at the same time, it kind of also is a bit of a backdrop element, which I think adds a lot of world flavor to the world, because this is something I think when you build a world, you need to think about these things. What do people eat? What sports do they play? What do they do for entertainment? And in Uduasha, the answer is roofball, as it seems to be across much of the empire. It sort of seems to be the national sport of this setting, or not the natural sport, the global sport of this setting.
Yeah.
Which makes sense, because mostly everyone lives in crowded cities, so it's the sport that has developed, right?
And of course,
Yeah.
with the themes that we've been exploring here, like a lot of the political social movements are going to be around popular culture and the popular culture of Duasha, and and I guess the broader world of Blades in the Dark. That's roofball is a prominent feature in the popular culture. So it is it's definitely going to come up with when waves are made in the social fabric. So.
Yeah, sports is a form of identity, and I think identity is something that this game is exploring. So in that sense, I think it's quite on point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we did also say that, in fact, Miraz and Vickers met playing roofball, right? So, like, it's also part of their, like, the backstory of their relationship.
Yeah.
This is funny because I am not a sporty person in any shape, way, or form. I think all sports should be taken out back and shot. Fine.
What about this noble sport of shooting sports out back?
Yes. As for me, I am probably the only person from a non-former English or English country that understands cricket. I think I'm the only one, and I quite enjoy it. But it otherwise seems to be exclusive to formerly British Empire countries.
I mean, the Dutch do play in the Cricket World Cup.
They
quite
do?
often, in
I
fact.
didn't know that.
Yeah.
Do you
I don't know if Emma knows this, but
Emma.
yeah.
Is this the game where you grab ostriches by their feet, stretch them out, and use them to hit hedgehogs that are curled up into balls, right?
No, that's croquet with an O.
Oh, I see.
I'm sorry. For a moment, I was like, "Is she making a really complicated joke?" And then I realized, no, that's croquet.
Oh, God.
So good.
I was meaning to make an Alice in Wonderland joke, but now it seems to have gotten away from me.
Just like the hedgehog.
I believe, in fact, one of the Dutch cricket players holds some kind of international record.
I would not be able to tell you.
Now you mention it, I probably have heard of that. Yeah, I'm not like a super fan of it or anything,
this
but I
was a
have
question more
watched.
for Tree, who I think would be more informed. Like, am I right? I think someone in the Netherlands cricket team has some kind of like quite an impressive international or record for probably like the T20 format of the game. Not important. Just thought I'd point it. Just thought I'd point out.
Sorry, I'm looking at this now. ODI records. The men's Netherlands cricket team has scored the highest team total of 315 for 8 versus Bermuda.
Well,
and
yeah, there you go. Like,
I don't know if is this true? The men's Netherlands cricket team player Wesley Baresi holds the record of highest individual score. But is this for the Netherlands?
Listen, I'm going to delete all of this.
Highest... Yeah, that's fine.
Yes.
Oh no, yeah, exactly. Like
we have
Rohit
straight
Sharma made 264.
I just want
We have got very far off topic.
I just wanted to
Delete this
make the
Klow.
point that the Netherlands are a powerhouse in international cricket.
That's fair. Okay,
Yeah.
so there is one country that has not been colonized by Britain but is good at cricket.
Yeah.
Good to know.
Exactly one, by the way.
Excellent. The reason but I think one of the things that I'm really interested in is that even though I do not participate in sports culture whatsoever, I grew up in a very, very sporty family, and Bangladesh is, despite having next to no presence in football, in any sort of like competitive or international scene, Bangladesh is pretty football crazy, and the whole Argentina versus Brazil thing is huge in Bangladesh. There's a particular part of Bangladesh called Brahmanbaria where there's fairly regularly someone gets killed for supporting the wrong team during the World Cup. It's a whole thing. There's clashes, and I think like that sort of like fervor makes any sort of sport super interesting. Because sports is politics, sports is culture. Like football ultras and the right wing. That's something I'm interested in, and so you can never really ignore sport in any sort of fictional setting. And I think there's also something interesting as a personal challenge of like playing someone who's notionally interested, really, really interested in a sport, as someone who is not sporty at all. So there's that as well.
Yeah, and we have in fact like introduced other sports as well, right? Like, so we know, for example, that there is hang gliding is one of the big sports in Uduasha, which is much more local. I certainly wrote something that I cannot recall exactly what it is now, but there was a sport that was like capture the flag, but with candles, I want to say.
Yes, yeah. I've just had an idea for a sport because Uduasha's got these steep slopes, right? And about a sport where that's about racing mountain goats downhill.
And in the end, you just
have
roast goat around the Udu.
In fact, I have found this. It is capture the flag with candles, but also I have just seen this message in our Discord chat of Prince saying, "I'm tempted to have my vice be cricket for some godforsaken reason." So, like, it was very early on in the campaign where we decided that, like, sport was gonna appear.
Oh god.
Aadiyat, are the goats that compete in your invention called Gavler goats?
Sorry?
Are they called
Oh,
Gavler
yes.
goats? I may be
Uh-huh.
saying this wrong, but I expect Vince will at least get this.
Yes, burning goats.
Yeah.
It's apparently become our thing now.
What?
What?
I'm
The internet
that a
has
thing?
decided.
I'm not familiar with this.
For those not familiar with it, Sweden has for like, okay, this is another tangent. We'll probably edit this out, but Sweden has for the past 200, 150 years, way far back, had a tradition of building gigantic straw goats every Christmas.
Oh.
And because they are gigantic goats made of straw, they tend to burn down. And
Mm.
one city in particular is famous for having arson as a Christmas tradition because it happens virtually every year.
I
And to be
definitely
clear, this is
am not editing this out. This is crucial information.
yes. And to be clear, this is not like a Guy Fawkes thing. The goat is not supposed to burn. It is supposed to be up as a decoration, and almost every year it burns down. And it's a whole thing. There are betting markets on how long it will survive. It's
Oh my
Yeah,
god.
it's
It's match
a thing
fixing.
that Sweden has gotten internationally famous for. We have our annual Christmas arson that is entirely illegal and not supposed to happen, but it happens anyway.
Well, I'll be looking forward to that about a month from now. I'll
Yep.
keep an eye out on the.
Yeah,
on the
I'm gonna keep an
news.
eye out.
Yes,
Yeah,
and
yeah, same.
again, this is not a planned thing. No one knows when it will happen. It's a giant goat made of straw. It's incredibly flammable. So
Just going to subscribe to.
It's
this
like
as a
some guy.
topic.
Yeah. Oh my god. Subscribe to Swedish goat burning as a topic on Google. Very good.
yes. Hmm.
Great. I think that we've mostly covered everything we wanted to cover. There's some stuff we didn't, but that was always going to be the case. We didn't quite get to the science in Uduasha, and we didn't quite get to how we were thinking about the politics of revolution and transformation. Maybe we could do that another day, because I did enjoy this chat. So maybe like once we're deeper in the campaign and we found out some more stuff about our game, that might be something that like we could explore. But I think for now, this seems like a good place to call it, unless anyone disagrees.
I think we
No.
could occasionally have like state of the podcast or like a hangout or like a discussion sort of thing. Whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
Yeah.
But for now, I don't think I've got anything else to add.
Yeah. So in that case, in the spirit of our collaboration, I'm going to ask each person to name one thing that they like about our world that someone else introduced. And I'm going to nominate Emma to go first because she is at the top of the Discord chat list.
Well, it's been discussed, but I absolutely love Worldbuilding, and it's incomprehensible. Incomprehensible rule set.
Nice. Yeah. It is also one of my favorite things. Yeah, absolutely. Klow?
I had thought of an answer to this, but then I got distracted by the Gafla goat. Actually, come back to me. I'm trying to remember what it was I was going to say.
Sure, no worries. Prince?
Yeah. So question is, what a favorite thing about the setting that we have come up with?
That's someone else has come up with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think for me the favorite thing honestly goes very far back to just when we started this, and it's the sheer verticality of Uduasha. The fact that the city is a funnel around the well in the middle. I forget who came up with that idea, but it has lended so much more weight to Roofball as a concept and to Vickers as a thing. Like the fact that I have a character who runs around on rooftops for fun in this like city of sheer drops. I really enjoy that aspect, and it makes the city very dramatic that we have all of these like places where people can fall very far indeed. So yeah.
Yeah, that's very cool. My favorite thing, which I think Zoheb said in like episode 1, and I always keep going back to this, is that there's a massive mirror that reflects firelight onto the city, and that's how Uduasha simulates day and night. I think it is such a mad idea, and it makes so much sense as a kind of thing that like someone would come up with, because they're like, well, there is no sun, but we have this massive, column of fire. Maybe we can make something with that. And I think it like informs a lot of the way that I think about the way the city looks, which I really enjoy. And lastly, Soap.
I think like one of my favorite things has actually been some of the NPCs, and I particularly liked Abbas's interactions with Zajitan. I really felt like the younger brother in those conversations. I think those were pretty. I don't know, it felt genuine. So thanks for that, Tree.
I have a lot of experience being an older brother, for what it's worth.
All right. I have one other favorite thing, which is silly, but I often think of the name Bahadur Badur, and I chuckle to myself. It's an incredible name.
We should have that guy up soon.
Yeah, we should bring him on screen.
I can't.
He's amazing.
I can't get it out of my head. I'll be making coffee, and then I'll think of Bahadur Badur, and I'll just snicker to myself.
Yeah.
I'm ready to answer the question. So my
Excellent.
favorite thing, I think it's probably a tie between. I think it was Emma who suggested the waxwork golems, or was that like everyone running with that idea and coming up with that? So that's definitely up there. But I definitely know that it was Aadiyat who came up with my other favorite thing, which is the two completely at war organizations that are one's trying to preserve Udaiput and its cultural heritage in the most militant and mindless like homeowners association way possible, and the other is a real estate ugly progress for the sake of ugly progress organization, like which is very similar to a certain organization that I will not name because it is possible that something bad might happen to me if I do, but like, haha, it's a good joke for everyone who knows what it is. Haha.
Yeah, very good.
Yeah.
Haha.
And I didn't say it was a reference to anything. Anyone could have that
No,
name.
No.
Yeah, anyone could have that name.
Any resemblance in this film to persons living or dead is completely coincidental. No offense is intended to any community in the subject matter of this film.
Yes, or to any brave bats.
Or to any brave bats, correct. Incredible.
Yep.
Then I think on that note, we can end our world building podcast. I'm not surprised that it ran on a bit longer than we thought it would. I think that was always a risk. But nonetheless, hopefully see you for our next episode. Until then, we're Desperate Attune, and goodbye.
And so blows out our brief candle. I named the disciples of the ceaseless temple thus, with both their given names and taken. Soumithri, called Tree. Zoheb, called Klow. Prince, Emma, and Aadiyat, called Soap. Intro music, Jalandhar by Kevin MacLeod. Outro music in Kiravani Ragam by Srinivas. Blades in the Dark by John Harper and Evil Hat Productions. Iruvian playbooks by Johnstone Metzger. Follow us at Desperate Attune on Twitter or email us at desperateattune@gmail.com. Support us at ko-fi.com/desperateattune.